let us call a truce to terror. The logical place to begin is a treaty assuring the end of nuclear tests of all kinds in every environment under workable controls. We also proposed a mutual ban on atmospheric testing without inspection or controls in order to save the human race from the poison of radioactive fallout. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames.
By March 1954, the brushfire war in Indochina was almost 8 years old, and the French position had deteriorated. Hoping to draw the communist guerrillas into decisive open battle, the French made a stand at the fortress of Dien Bien Phu. But by mid-March, the French forces were surrounded and cut off. Military aid from the United States had made it possible for France to maintain the war. But in spite of an ever-increasing flow of supplies, the French cause appeared doomed. The question of American military intervention was raised.
This might have serious risks, but these risks are far less than would face us a few years from now if we dare not be resolute today.
Senator Kennedy felt otherwise.
I am reluctant to make any statement which may be misinterpreted as unappreciative of the gallant French struggle at Dien Bien Phu and elsewhere. But the speeches of President Eisenhower and Secretary Dulles and others have left too much unsaid. For if the American people are, for the fourth time in this century, to travel the long and tortuous road of war, particularly a war which we now realize would threaten the survival of civilization, then I believe we have a right to inquire in detail into the nature of the struggle in which we may become engaged. Certainly, I, for one, favor a policy of united action by many nations whenever necessary to achieve a military and political victory for the free world in that area, realizing full well that it may require some commitment of manpower. But to pour money, material, and men into the jungles of Indochina without at least a remote prospect of victory would be dangerously futile and self-destructive. Of course, all discussions of united action assume the inevitability of such victory. But such assumptions are not unlike similar predictions of confidence which have lulled the American people for many years. I am frankly of the belief that no amount of American military assistance in Indochina can conquer an enemy which is everywhere and at the same time nowhere. An enemy of the people which has the sympathy and covert support of the people. If the French persist in their refusal to grant the legitimate independence and freedom desired by the peoples of the Associated States, and if those peoples and the other peoples of Asia remain aloof from the conflict as they have in the past, then it is my hope that Secretary Dulles will recognize the futility of channeling American men and machines into that hopeless struggle.
I think that we should have insisted 4 or 5 years ago that the French get out of French Indochina and permit a free native government to set up as we did in Indonesia in the case of the Dutch.
Military action in Indochina. French regulars land along the coast in search of roving communist bands. For France, it represents a tremendous sacrifice of manpower and financial resources. Without American help, the burden would be too great.
I think perhaps if we go over to the map here, I can indicate to you why it is so vitally important. Here is Indochina. If Indochina falls, Thailand is put in almost impossible position.
Nixon becomes one of the first hawks to warn of the domino effect of communist aggression.
That indicates to you and to all of us why it is vitally important that Indochina not go behind the Iron Curtain.
1 year later, in 1954, French forces are besieged by the communists at a place called Dien Bien Phu. A massive resupply operation fails to tip the balance. Nixon is one of the first to favor military intervention, but President Eisenhower won't commit troops to a ground war in Asia. Nixon supports the use of tactical nuclear weapons, but Ike says the sun is still shining. Dien Bien Phu isn't the end of the world. Dien Bien Phu falls. The French surrender. In Geneva, a peace conference leaves Vietnam divided into a communist north and a non-communist south. But there is to be no peace in Vietnam.
Under pressure of growing communist aggression, the flow of American equipment and advisors is increased.
In the 1950s, Nixon backs the deployment of American military advisors to South Vietnam.
Superior equipment and mobility are used to full advantage to carry the fight to the enemy swiftly, wherever his presence becomes known.
If Indochina goes, several things happen right away. The Krop Peninsula, the last little bit of end hanging on down there, would be scarcely defensible. The tin and the tungsten that we so greatly value from that area would cease coming.
The letters and the reports we had on Ho Chi Minh's attitude back in 1946, he wrote, I think it was 7 letters to this government and received no reply. The pathos almost, the sadness that here's a man who felt and believed the United States would be sympathetic to his purpose of gaining his independence from a colonial power. And then to find this is what he'd read, he'd been here, he'd read our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. He thought surely the United States would be interested. We had testimony in the committee that his one worry was that it was so insignificant. Vietnam was so far away and so insignificant, we would never bother about it. It's too small to ever attract the attention of the United States. He was sure in his own mind that if we would ever put our minds and focus upon it, we would be for him. How different history would have been for us and for them if we had felt a common interest in the colonial province like Vietnam seeking its independence of France.
Colonel Fletcher Prouty.
At the time of the Kennedy assassination, I was the Chief of Special Operations in the Joint Staff, working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Special Operations in those days was a euphemism for the military support of the clandestine operations of CIA around the world.
Prouty was an insider who claimed that while some in the Pentagon were gearing up for war, he was secretly helping President Kennedy plan for peace.
So during the summer, July, August, and September, he had a very experienced group of people work on his new policy for Vietnam. It was published in October, and it was called the National Security Action Memorandum number 263. And that memorandum, signed under the direction of the President, was to bring men home by Christmas and get everybody out by 1965.
What we're looking at here are approximately 15,000 pages of documents on Kennedy's Vietnam policies that I've collected from all the archives in the United States. In some cases, and many of them are newly declassified.
In a new book, JFK and Vietnam, military historian Major John Newman offers his conclusions about Kennedy's Vietnam policy.
I don't think there's any doubt that JFK was pulling out of Vietnam when he was killed. And I think because the most fundamental tenet of his policy was no combat troops, and we know that Johnson put in combat troops, I feel it's safe to say that the assassination led directly to the escalation of the war.
Did that policy change after the assassination?
Only 4 days later.
What happened?
4 days later, under Lyndon Johnson, they issued a new National Security Action Memorandum, number 273, which began a modest change. Then in March of '64, another memorandum, 288, began the attacks on North Vietnam and the escalation of the war.